The light inside Thornhill Mansion was a cruel kind of golden. It spilled from the chandeliers like judgment, spotlighting the polished shoes, the clinking glasses, the laughter behind false smiles. And then, silence. The kind of silence that stretches too long. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. She stood in the doorway, alone. Her dress was made of old gray linen, faded along the seams, the hem brushing her ankles with every soft step. Over her shoulders hung a green cardigan, sagging slightly, as though tired from years of wear. Her shoes were flat, quiet. But her posture was upright. Still. Like someone who belonged in a different kind of room. And maybe once had. A woman near the fireplace raised her champagne flute without drinking. Her lips curled in amusement. "Did someone leave the service door open?" she murmured, loud enough for those around to hear. Laughter trickled through the room like spilled perfume. Another voice, this time from a man with a yellow tie and a permanent smirk. "I thought this was a private reading. Not a costume party." Still she stood, one hand gently clutching the strap of a faded cloth bag, the other brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her eyes, warm brown, unreadable, scanned the faces before her. She didn't flinch. Didn't reply. Just breathed, shallow and slow. Behind her, the mansion door closed with a soft click. That sound was somehow louder than the voices around her. She must have heard the rumors. Clara Simmons whispered into her phone, already snapping photos, adding filters without waiting for captions. Her followers would love this. Logan's last affair, maybe. Crashing the will reading for a final shot at the throne. Ivy didn't blink. She moved forward slowly, step by step across the marble floor, her shoes silent as secrets. Each footfall was a quiet refusal. Not of what they said, but of what they believed. From behind the drink table, Gerald Hayes raised an eyebrow. "God, the audacity," he said with a chuckle, swirling his glass. "Look at her. Walking in here like she owns the place." Marissa Reed, in a blood-red dress cut like a dagger, turned slightly, her eyes glinting. "Darling," she said, her voice sugar-dipped poison, "some people don't know where they stand. It's cute. Tragic. But mostly cute." Then she stepped in front of Ivy, blocking her path just enough to force a pause. She leaned in. Her perfume was overwhelming, something expensive, laced with superiority. "What's your name?" she asked sweetly. "Ivy," the woman replied, her voice like velvet laid over steel. Marissa tilted her head. "Of course it is." Then, with a wink to the crowd, she gently touched the edge of Ivy's cardigan between two fingers, lifting it like a piece of lint. "Vintage. Brave choice." Someone near the piano let out a low whistle. Ivy lowered her gaze only for a moment. A long breath escaped her lips. But her hands remained steady, gripping the strap of her bag tighter. Just for a second, her thumb traced a fraying seam near the zipper, a habit born of memory, not fear. In the far corner, Arthur Grayson, the family lawyer, looked up from his briefcase. His expression didn't change. Not yet. Clara kept filming. Trevor Monroe, sipping something dark, leaned into a friend's ear. "She doesn't belong here. Just look at her." Logan would have laughed. At that moment, someone giggled. The kind of laugh that's sharp and small, like breaking porcelain. Ivy turned her head slowly toward the sound. The chandelier above caught her face in a single slice of light. For just a heartbeat, everyone saw it. A flicker. Not of shame. Not even pain. But of memory. Then, as if rehearsed, the wave of laughter resumed. Someone played a cruel melody on the piano. Elise Carter mouthed the word "pathetic" and walked past Ivy, bumping her shoulder without apology. Still, Ivy walked forward. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't demand respect. She simply moved with a kind of grace that didn't ask permission. Like the floor remembered her even if they didn't. Preston Reed, the eldest heir, chuckled and tossed a napkin onto the floor near her feet. Maybe she's here to clean up after us. Another ripple of laughter. Someone dropped a pearl earring just to see if Ivy would bend to pick it up. She didn't. The silence returned, heavier this time. Thicker. And it hung over her like smoke. She stopped by a large arched window, where the April sunlight filtered through stained glass and threw fractured color across her cardigan. Outside, the wind moved through the hills like an unseen voice. Inside, no one said a word that wasn't sharp-edged. Her eyes stayed fixed on a point no one could see. Not even the chandelier light touched her gaze now. She stood there, just breathing. Quiet. Present. Unmoved. No one noticed Arthur Grayson watching her a little too closely. Not yet. No one noticed the photo inside her bag. The one folded carefully in a linen handkerchief. The one taken 7 years ago on a courthouse lawn in New Jersey, Ivy in a modest white dress, Logan beside her in a navy suit, smiling like a man who had everything he ever wanted. But right now, she was just the strange black woman at the reading. Just a mistake someone forgot to escort out. Just a body in the wrong room. But they didn't know. She wasn't just a guest. She wasn't just a woman with an old dress and quiet shoes. She wasn't just a passing shadow in a room drunk on its own reflection. They didn't know. She wasn't just a stranger at Thornhill Mansion. She wasn't just a name on no one's list. Because the woman they just mocked wasn't just a visitor. She was the storm they never saw coming. The cold from the windowpane seeped through her cardigan as Ivy stood still, her fingers resting on the worn strap of her bag. The voices behind her had blurred into one long echo of cruelty, but her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere darker. Somewhere quieter. A memory crept in, uninvited. Years ago, Logan had brought her to a park in springtime. The trees were dressed in pink blossoms, and a fountain danced in the distance. He held her hand like it was something sacred. That day, he had whispered against her temple, "One day they'll know who you really are. And they'll bow to it." He kissed her cheek then, and she had smiled, not because she believed him, but because he did. But that was before the will. Before the sickness. Before the crash. Now, she was alone in a room full of eyes that only knew how to weigh diamonds and bloodlines. They couldn't see value without a receipt. Her wedding had no orchestra, no press release, no designer dress to validate her presence here. It had only held truth. And truth, in this mansion, had no currency. She moved to the far corner, away from the glittering bodies, away from the spotlight. Her breath trembled, just once. Just enough. A low table near her bore a vase of white roses, crisp and flawless. Ivy reached out, brushing the edge of a petal. It felt cold. Too perfect. Like everything in this place. She turned her face slightly, just enough to glimpse the oil painting on the wall, Logan's grandfather, seated sternly in a mahogany chair, his hand resting on a thick book. His painted eyes stared at her with the same judgment she'd seen today. And yesterday. And for most of her life. She looked away. Her hands tightened. She remembered another room. A smaller one. A hospital room. Logan lying still, the machines clicking rhythmically beside him. He had looked so tired, his skin pale against the white sheets. Ivy had held his hand every night. They had spoken of nothing grand, just coffee, books, and gardens. The kind of dreams people only chase when they realize how fragile time is. He had told her then, "If I go first, make sure they don't rewrite me." She had promised. Now here she was, keeping a promise in silence while wolves circled, laughing. Across the room, Clara Simmons took another photo and pretended to check her lipstick. Ivy saw it but didn't react. Gerald made another toast, raising his glass to a name he'd never respected. Elise whispered something cruel to Marissa, who responded with a grin as sharp as a blade. Ivy lowered her gaze. She wasn't afraid of being seen anymore. She was afraid of being erased. Of Logan being turned into a myth those people could mold and retell and profit from. That's why she was here. Not for the money. Not for revenge. For memory. For truth. The truth that once, Logan Thornhill had loved a woman in a faded white dress. That he had signed his name beside hers on a certificate no one here had ever seen. That his love did not require approval, only courage. Ivy breathed in through her nose, steadying her chest. But it hurt. Because underneath the grace and the poise and the silence, there was grief. Real, unyielding grief. The kind that clung to the skin like ash and left a scar no diamond could polish away. Somewhere behind her, someone laughed again. Ivy didn't turn. She remembered how Logan used to silence rooms just by entering them. How his voice would glide through a boardroom like a cello note, commanding in calm. How he once stood up in a gala and told the press he was stepping down from 3 boards to spend more time with the one person who taught me what real success looks like. They didn't ask who she was. They never did. She walked slowly along the edge of the room, her fingers grazing a velvet curtain, her shadow falling long against the marble floor. No one looked at her now. Not really. To them, she was already forgotten, dismissed, a minor disruption in their pageantry. But not everyone. Michael Reed, the quiet librarian who had known Logan since college, watched her with a flicker of recognition. He remembered the woman who once picked up Logan's notes at the library desk. He had thought she was just a friend. But now there was something more in her stance. A familiar weight in her eyes. He said nothing. But his gaze lingered. Anna Brooks, the petite woman who maintained the garden, peeked from the hallway. She remembered seeing Ivy once, hands in the soil, laughing softly at Logan's clumsy planting skills. Anna had thought they were just neighbors. But neighbors don't look at each other the way he had looked at her. Still, Ivy said nothing. She passed the grand piano and paused, just briefly. One hand hovered over the keys but never touched them. She used to play. Before Logan, before the world had told her songs weren't worth hearing. She missed the sound. Not the notes. The release. Near the buffet, someone knocked over a flute of champagne and cursed. Ivy flinched. But she didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the funeral. The fake one. The one with too many cameras and not enough truth. She had sat in the back then, in black, while these people sniffed crocodile tears and whispered about assets. They hadn't known she existed. And yet they mourned him louder than she could. Because her grief had been quiet. Real. Made of sleepless nights and empty cups. Not Instagram tributes and rehearsed sorrow. She reached into her bag and touched the corner of the wedding photo, folded inside a handkerchief stitched by her mother. Her fingers stayed there a moment longer than she intended. Not for comfort. But for grounding. For proof that she hadn't imagined all of it. That love like theirs had existed. She heard footsteps approach. A low voice beside her. "Excuse me," said Sarah Ellis, the nurse who had tended to Logan in his final months. I remember you." Ivy turned, her expression unreadable. "You used to bring books," Sarah continued, eyes softening. "And black coffee. No sugar. You always sat by the window, right?" Ivy gave the smallest nod. Sarah looked down. "He talked about you. He just never said your name. Said some things were too sacred for headlines." Ivy's lip trembled, almost imperceptibly. Sarah gently touched Ivy's hand. "I'm glad you're here." Then she walked away. Quiet. Respectful. The chandelier flickered slightly as the wind pushed against the stained glass windows again. Outside, the trees bent low, as though bowing. Ivy stood taller. Behind her, Marissa's laughter cut through the air again, loud and oblivious. Gerald's voice bellowed some new joke. Clara's camera clicked twice more. None of them knew they were seconds away from unraveling. Ivy stepped back into the center of the room. Not to be seen, but to prepare. Because grief is not silence. It is patience. And justice, real justice, doesn't scream. It arrives like her. Soft. Still. And unstoppable. The room buzzed with shallow chatter, clinking glasses, and a barely hidden buzz of anticipation, like bees gathering around a hive that had yet to open. Ivy remained still near the far window, her back straight, her hands calm. But something in the air had shifted. Not just tension. Not just suspicion. Something else. Something quieter. Michael Reed hadn't taken his eyes off her since the moment she stepped into the grand hall. He stood near the edge of the room, cradling a whiskey glass he hadn't touched. His tweed jacket hung a little too loose, his tie slightly off-center, but his gaze was sharp, focused. There was something about the way she carried herself. Her silence wasn't the silence of someone small. It was the silence of someone waiting. Someone, remembering. He leaned slightly toward Anna Brooks, the groundskeeper who had wandered in with a bouquet she wasn't sure where to place. "Have you seen her before?" he asked, voice low. Anna hesitated, biting her lip. Her muddy work boots were out of place on the polished marble, but she didn't seem to care. She glanced at Ivy. "I think," Anna's voice trailed off. "One spring. Years ago. I saw Mr. Thornhill planting roses in the back garden. He wasn't alone. She was with him. He laughed a lot that day." Michael nodded once, slowly. "She laughed too," Anna added after a pause. "She had dirt on her nose. He kissed it clean. Like it was the most natural thing in the world." Michael looked down into his glass. "They never published anything about a wife. Does it matter?" Anna whispered. "Only to the people who think wealth makes blood." In the center of the room, Clara Simmons posed beside a massive vase of imported peonies, taking another filtered selfie. She tilted her head just enough to show her neckline, her diamond earrings glinting like bait. She didn't notice Ivy. Or maybe she chose not to. To Clara, only things with likes mattered. And Ivy, in her linen dress and dusty shoes, was invisible. But Michael saw everything. Especially the bag. That old, faded canvas thing hanging on Ivy's shoulder, it wasn't new. He remembered it. 7 years ago, Logan had stopped by the library on a rainy afternoon. He was soaked, his umbrella useless against the wind. But he had smiled, placing a wrapped parcel of books on the counter. "Can you give this to her?" Logan had asked. Michael had opened the parcel. Inside were a rare first-edition collection of Langston Hughes poems and a small handwritten note folded inside an ivory envelope. Tucked beneath them, an old cloth handkerchief embroidered with the initials, I.W. The bag Ivy carried now bore a subtle stitch near the seam, a tear mended with silver thread in a cross pattern. Michael's brow furrowed. It was the same bag. And now it was here, inside Thornhill Mansion, where wolves dressed in silk and designer leather waited for scraps of empire. He stepped back slightly, watching as Ivy reached into the bag and adjusted something inside, maybe a photo, or a letter. He couldn't tell. But her fingers lingered like they were touching something sacred. Michael walked to Arthur Grayson, the family lawyer, standing calmly near the front of the hall, flipping through notes. Grayson raised an eyebrow as Michael approached. "She's not just a stranger," Michael said quietly. Grayson didn't look surprised. He merely closed his leather folder and exhaled softly. "I know," the lawyer replied. "How long have you known?" Michael asked. "Long enough to prepare for this day." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy. Then Grayson added, "You saw it too, didn't you?" The way she walks in here, like the house remembers her more than the people do. Michael nodded. Logan was never careless. If he trusted someone enough to keep them hidden, it wasn't to protect them from scandal. It was to protect them from this. He swept a hand across the room, toward the glittering disdain, the laughter too loud, the eyes too cold. Grayson's gaze followed, but his voice remained even. They don't see her. Not really. They will, Michael said. Just then, a sudden hush moved like a ripple through the room. Not total silence, but the kind that stretches like a held breath. Marissa Reed had turned, eyes narrowed, watching Ivy from across the chandelier-lit room. Something about the way Ivy had paused at the base of the grand staircase, her hand resting gently on the carved mahogany railing, it triggered something. Not memory. Instinct. Marissa squinted, stepping away from her circle of admirers. That cardigan, she murmured to herself. Gerald Hayes glanced at her. What? I've seen it before, she whispered. Not on a maid. On someone else. Gerald smirked. Everyone has a twin in thrift stores. No, Marissa snapped, then caught herself. She softened her tone. That shade. That stitching. It's familiar. Across the room, Clara scrolled through her phone, bored. You're overthinking, she said, not even looking up. But Marissa kept staring. Not at the dress. Not at the bag. At the way Ivy moved. Graceful. Measured. Like someone used to standing in rooms like this. Like someone who had nothing to prove. Anna Brooks wandered closer to Ivy, pretending to fix the corner of a tablecloth. She glanced up, their eyes meeting briefly. I remember the daffodils, Anna said quietly. Ivy didn't respond, but her eyes softened. They bloom early here, Anna added. But they only last if someone cares for them. There was a pause. Ivy finally replied. Logan said daffodils were brave flowers, she whispered. They return even when winter hasn't left yet. Anna smiled, eyes shining. You were with him that day, weren't you? I never left, Ivy said. The words weren't loud. But they carried. Michael heard them. Marissa heard them. Even Grayson, still near the table, closed his folder just a little tighter. The chandelier above flickered again, catching the silver thread in Ivy's bag, the same thread Logan had once described as a stitch of stubborn hope. A few guests noticed now. They didn't say anything. But the seeds had been planted. Gerald glanced at Ivy, then at Grayson, then at Marissa. He frowned. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. And Ivy, still in her quiet corner, simply turned and began to walk toward the center of the room. She wasn't alone anymore. Michael Reed took a step forward. Anna placed the bouquet down and stood straighter. Sarah Ellis, standing near the wall, raised her chin ever so slightly. Not everyone had forgotten. And something about that was more powerful than the diamonds glittering on the wrists of those waiting to inherit a throne they never earned. The storm hadn't come yet. But the wind had shifted. And some in the room were starting to feel it. Not on their skin. But in their bones. The chandelier above the grand hall glimmered brighter than before, though no one had touched the switch. Maybe it was the way the light hit Ivy now, no longer as an afterthought in the corner, but at the center of a stage none of them realized they'd been performing on. Her steps were measured, slow, but deliberate. Like she knew exactly where she was headed and why. Arthur Grayson placed a heavy leather briefcase on the long ebony table and clicked it open. The sound, though small, echoed like a bell tolling through the hall. Conversations faltered. Laughter stopped mid-breath. Everyone turned. Gerald Hayes tilted his head with suspicion. Clara Simmons frowned and instinctively checked her phone, as if reassurance could still be found on social media. Marissa Reed remained frozen, her glass raised but untouched, her knuckles white around the stem. Grayson's voice cut through the hush, low and steady. "This is the final testament of Mr. Logan Alexander Thornhill, notarized and sealed 3 years ago." A chill rolled across the room like fog. Clara whispered, "We all know how this goes." Her smirk faltered when Grayson pulled out a single envelope, sealed with red wax and the Thornhill crest. He held it up. "This document," he said, "contains not only the names of those Mr. Thornhill wished to include in his will, but also his final message to all of you." The room leaned in as one body. Ivy remained still. Grayson sliced the seal open with a silver letter opener. His hands didn't tremble. "Before I begin," he said, "Mr. Thornhill left instructions that one particular statement be read aloud before any names are announced." He unfolded a single sheet and read, "What matters is not the titles you carry, nor the diamonds you wear. What matters is how you treat the ones you believe have nothing." The silence sharpened. No one moved. "Let it be known," Grayson continued, "that the inheritance shall not go to those who mocked, who judged, who dismissed the presence of one soul standing in this very room." He turned and looked directly at Ivy Walker. The ripple hit the room like an earthquake. Marissa Reed stood so fast her chair screeched against the marble floor. "What is this? Some kind of stunt?" Grayson didn't blink. "It's the truth." Gerald Hayes scoffed. "That woman isn't even supposed to be here. She wasn't invited." "She didn't need an invitation," Grayson replied calmly. "She lives here. And has for years." A gasp. Sharp and collective. Clara nearly dropped her phone. "What are you saying?" she asked, voice cracking. "She's the housekeeper." Grayson smiled faintly. "She is Ivy Walker, the legal and only wife of Logan Thornhill." Time seemed to stop. Then unravel. Clara's mouth opened but no words came. Gerald turned red then pale. Marissa's champagne glass slipped from her hand and shattered at her feet, its sound barely noticed over the sudden intake of breath in the hall. "No," Gerald said, stepping forward. "No. That's not possible." Grayson opened another folder. Marriage certificate. Witnessed and filed in Essex County. June 14, 7 years ago. Witnesses, Sarah Ellis, Michael Reed. Michael stepped forward, slow but unshaken. "I saw them say their vows. I saw how he looked at her." Sarah, too, stepped forward, her eyes wet but fierce. "I held her hand the morning she married him." Logan was never more certain of anything. Anna Brooks didn't speak. She didn't have to. She simply stepped beside Ivy and stood with her. Marissa's voice came out like a blade. "Then where has she been all these years? Hiding?" Ivy turned, her voice soft but unflinching. "I was never hiding," she said. "I was living quietly, away from the poison that fills this house." Logan wanted peace, not politics. He asked me to stay in the shadows because he knew what would happen if I didn't. The accusation landed like a strike. Clara's face crumpled. "This is a lie. He would have told us. He loved us." "No," Ivy said simply. "He loved who he thought you could be. Not what you chose to become." Grayson stepped forward with a stack of documents. Bank records. Joint accounts. A trust fund established in her name. Letters. Photographs. Personal recordings of Logan confirming her identity. And this. He raised a remote. A large screen descended from the ceiling. No one noticed the mechanism before. The screen flickered, then settled on an image, Logan Thornhill. Alive. Older. His hair was grayer, but his eyes, the steel blue that cut through pretense, were unchanged. Gasps scattered through the room like sparks from dry wood. Clara collapsed onto a nearby chair. Gerald clutched his chest. Marissa didn't move. Couldn't. "Hello," Logan's voice said, steady from the video. "If you're watching this, then it means I've gone through with my decision. I couldn't fake my own death, my plane crash was real. But I made sure to leave behind a legacy not built on entitlement, but on truth." His eyes, even through the screen, pinned them all. "My wife, Ivy, was the only one who ever saw me, not the empire, not the money, just me." He paused. "And today, you saw her. And you showed her exactly who you are." Silence. Then he smiled, just a little. "So, to those who mocked her, who laughed, who filmed her like a spectacle, you will receive nothing." Gasps became cries. Clara's phone clattered to the floor. Gerald cursed under his breath. Logan's voice didn't waver. "To Sarah Ellis, Michael Reed, and Anna Brooks, who treated Ivy with decency when you thought no one was watching, you will receive lifetime support and a seat at every table she builds." Grayson pressed pause. For a moment, there was nothing but breathing. Uneven. Staggered. Shock had turned the air thin and unkind. Ivy remained in the center. Her eyes scanned the room. "I didn't come here for revenge," she said. "I came to see if there was still something good left in this house." Her voice, though quiet, filled the walls. "And now I know." She turned to Grayson. He nodded once and placed the signed transfer papers into her hands. Gerald tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Clara buried her face. Marissa stood motionless, her eyes locked on Ivy's as if trying to remember who she was when they first met. If they ever truly had. No one could move. Not yet. Because the truth had landed. And it didn't roar. It whispered. And the whisper was enough to bring the walls of Thornhill Mansion crumbling down, not in bricks or mortar, but in pride, in delusion, in everything they thought was untouchable. And Ivy. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She simply stood with the weight of truth behind her. And that weight was greater than all the diamonds in the room. The silence that followed was the kind that made the grand chandelier above seem too loud, its delicate crystal clinks like sharp reminders of everything that had shattered just moments ago. No one moved. No one dared to. Gerald Hayes had lowered himself into the nearest chair, his hands shaking, eyes darting from Ivy to the now black screen where Logan's face had disappeared. His mouth opened once, then closed. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't crumble under the weight of what had just been exposed. Clara Simmons sat slumped, her designer heels half off her feet, the straps hanging like they too had given up trying to keep her upright. Her phone lay shattered on the marble floor, the final notification still visible through a web of cracked glass, viral already. 94K views. A video that now mocked her, not Ivy. Her lips moved as if trying to summon some defense, but all she could whisper was, "They saw everything." Marissa stood as if frozen mid-pose, one hand still clutching the strap of her purse, her posture elegant and empty. Her face had hardened into something too fragile to hold. Her eyes were fixed on Ivy, not with contempt now, but confusion. Disbelief. A faint, haunting echo of something she hadn't let herself feel in years, shame. But Ivy didn't look at any of them for long. She turned her gaze to Grayson, her voice steady. "There's no need to remove them. Let them stay. Let them listen." Grayson gave a slow, respectful nod. "I don't need an audience," Ivy said softly. "But maybe they need the silence." She stepped forward, not to gloat, not to address them. She walked toward the center of the room, the same center where they had gathered like wolves at the beginning. Her feet echoed quietly on the marble, the same marble they once expected her to mop. But now, the floor belonged to her. Anna Brooks came forward first. She didn't speak, just wrapped her arms around Ivy's waist in a brief, trembling hug. When she pulled away, her eyes were red, but her smile was real. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael Reed stepped up next, placing a hand gently over his heart, nodding once, as if words would only get in the way. Sarah Ellis reached out last, brushing Ivy's shoulder softly, like a nurse calming a patient, or perhaps thanking one. Ivy touched her hand in return. Then Ivy looked back toward the room still cloaked in silence. She didn't ask for attention. But it came. "You think silence is weakness," she said, her tone quiet, conversational, like someone telling a bedtime story. "But silence is where truth waits." And today, it waited long enough. No one argued. Not even Marissa. Preston Reed, once so loud, so sure, had receded to the back of the hall, gripping the edge of a table as if it might keep him from collapsing under the weight of his own reflection. Ivy turned again to Grayson. "May I speak as the new legal executor of the Thornhill estate?" Grayson smiled faintly. "You may, Mrs. Thornhill." That name landed like a song too beautiful for them to bear. She walked back to the table, hands light on the old wood. "There won't be lawsuits," she said. "There won't be revenge. What you've done is already documented. And more importantly, seen." She paused. "And in some ways, that's more permanent than any punishment I could impose." Clara lifted her head. "You're not pressing charges." Ivy didn't smile. But there was something kind behind her stillness. "I'm not interested in dragging anyone through court. You've already convicted yourselves." Clara's mascara had smeared. Her voice cracked. "Why?" Ivy's voice never wavered. "Because I know what it feels like to be invisible in a room full of people who pretend they see everything. And I won't become what I stood against." Marissa's lips moved then, barely audible. "What do you want from us?" Ivy looked at her, long and full. "Nothing. I already have everything I need. Logan saw me. That was enough." A pause. "And now the world sees me too." She turned her gaze back to Anna, to Sarah, to Michael. "But what I do want, is to rebuild this house. Not in stone. In kindness. In second chances." She looked down at the marble, where her reflection now shared the space with the gold trim of her inheritance and the ghosts of a legacy long left to rot. "This mansion will become something else," she said. "A place where worth isn't defined by bloodlines, but by humanity." There were no gasps this time. Only stillness. From the far end of the room, Gerald rose slowly. He walked forward like a man no longer sure how to hold his head, his suit rumpled, his arrogance dissolved. He stopped a few feet away from Ivy. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "You're right not to," Ivy replied. "But I still wanted to say," he swallowed. "I'm sorry. It wasn't much. But it cracked something." Marissa, watching him, finally stepped forward. Her voice, once honeyed with venom, was now brittle glass. "I didn't think you mattered," she said, her eyes blinking fast. "Because Logan never spoke about you. I assumed that meant, you were a mistake." Ivy met her gaze. "Or maybe I was what he wanted to protect from all of this." Marissa lowered her eyes. "I said things," she began. "I remember," Ivy answered. "Every word." Another silence fell. And still, Ivy didn't condemn them. She turned to the shattered glass on the floor, the champagne pooling like a broken crown. She took a napkin from the table and knelt slowly, pressing it into the spill with graceful ease. Marissa moved next to her, knees clicking on marble. She helped, her red dress sweeping across the floor she once ruled. No one laughed. Because something in that moment, two women, one wiping glass, the other wiping away everything she thought she knew, was too human to mock. When they stood again, Ivy touched her faded linen dress, smoothing it over her hips. The dress hadn't changed. But now the room around her had. Grayson cleared his throat. "There are still logistics to handle. Legal notices. Formal transfers. Security adjustments. Ivy nodded. You'll stay on as counsel. I would be honored. He bowed slightly, not from obligation, but reverence. Ivy turned to the crowd, now smaller in spirit, quieter in breath. You may leave now, she said. No anger. No vengeance. Just a quiet dismissal that held more authority than any shouted command. Clara picked up the shattered remains of her phone, cradling it like a wound. Gerald, with his hand on Marissa's back, walked slowly toward the exit. Preston followed, head lowered. One by one, they left, each step heavier than the last. And Ivy? She remained. In the middle of Thornhill's grand hall. Not victorious. Just free. The room was empty now, except for the ones who had mattered all along. Ivy stood in the center of the grand hall, where laughter had once sounded like knives, now replaced by quiet stillness that felt like a soft breath after a storm. Her eyes wandered to the tall windows where the April sun bled through sheer curtains, painting soft gold onto the marble floor. There was peace in the silence, not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that follows release. Anna Brooks approached first, still in her gardening apron, her hands stained with traces of earth. She held a small object out, a white rose wrapped in tissue, its stem freshly trimmed. I found it growing behind the east greenhouse, she said softly. It blooms late every year, but it always blooms. Thought it might belong here, now. Ivy accepted the rose gently, brushing her fingers across its petals. It does, she whispered, then placed it in the nearest vase on the long ebony table, where once only greed had gathered. Sarah Ellis stepped closer next, eyes wet but smiling. You could have destroyed them, she said. But you didn't. I didn't need to, Ivy replied. They did that all by themselves. Michael Reed stood further back, near the massive portrait of Logan that had hung for decades, stern, formal, intimidating. Now, it felt like a veil had been lifted. He once told me, Michael said, that he believed people would always show you who they are, if you were quiet long enough to let them talk. He was right, Ivy said, stepping closer. But silence wasn't just a tool. It was my shield. Michael nodded. You held it better than most ever could. Ivy turned to them, to the trio who had offered kindness without knowing her name. You didn't have to stand by me today. But you did. That's something I won't forget. Sarah smiled gently. Sometimes, it's the ones without power who recognize dignity fastest. The warmth in that line lingered. Ivy walked the hall slowly, tracing her fingers across the old wooden furniture, the velvet drapes, the cracked frames. Everything still stood, but the soul of the mansion had shifted. No longer a temple to legacy and bloodlines, it was now something new. A place where truth had stripped power from cruelty, and restored it to grace. Later that afternoon, Ivy sat alone in Logan's old study. The room was untouched since the last time she'd seen him, mahogany shelves, leather-bound volumes, the lingering scent of cedar and ink. On the desk, tucked beneath a thick paperweight, she found the letter again. Logan's handwriting, always neat, slanted gently like he was whispering through the ink. If you're reading this, it means they failed the test, the letter began. But you didn't. You never did. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the paper back. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Grief had carved its way through her years ago, but now it had been replaced by something firmer. A quiet, unshakable peace. From the hall, soft footsteps approached. Anna peeked in. Forgive me, she said, but there's a young woman at the gate. She says she's looking for work. Her name's Jasmine. Just graduated. Wants a housekeeping job. Says she heard there was a place here, different from others. Ivy stood. Send her in. Anna hesitated. She's a lot like you were. Quiet. Eyes that hold more than she'll ever say. Ivy nodded. Then she's exactly who we're looking for. When Jasmine entered moments later, 20-something, hesitant, clutching her resume with both hands, Ivy saw it immediately. The same look in her eyes. The same guarded posture. The same flicker of hope wrapped in self-defense. "You don't need to explain," Ivy said, offering a chair. Jasmine blinked. "But I haven't even told you my story." "You already did," Ivy replied. "By showing up." They spoke for a while, about her schooling, her dreams, her grandmother who once worked as a maid but dreamed of owning a bookshop. Ivy listened carefully, never interrupting. And when Jasmine finished, Ivy leaned forward. "There's no need to work beneath people here. We don't do that anymore. We work beside each other. How would you feel about helping me rebuild this place?" Jasmine looked confused. "Rebuild it into what?" Ivy smiled softly. "A place where quiet voices are the first to be heard." The girl's eyes shimmered. That night, the dining hall was lit with warm candles and no crystal chandeliers. Just Ivy, Sarah, Michael, Anna, and a few new faces, cooks, gardeners, assistants, those who had once existed at the edge of vision now brought into the heart of the house. They ate simple food, laughed without tension, and toasted not to wealth, but to worth. No one wore suits or gowns. No one spoke over another. Jasmine sat beside Ivy, whispering about a poem she loved as a child. Ivy listened, her hands folded neatly, eyes never drifting away. After the meal, Ivy stood, glass in hand. This house once echoed with pride. With arrogance. And silence soaked in judgment. But starting now, it will echo with something else. She paused. Laughter. Compassion. Truth. The room exhaled. No one will be turned away because of the clothes they wear. Or the name they carry. Or the color of their skin. You'll be seen. You'll be heard. She raised her glass. To new beginnings. They echoed it back. To new beginnings. The following week, construction began on the lower level. Ivy had decided the ballroom, once used for galas filled with pretense, would become a community library and education center. For girls like Jasmine. For children from town. For anyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. One afternoon, Ivy stood in a half-finished room, dust in her hair, sunlight spilling through scaffolding. Jasmine stood beside her, paint on her hands. "Miss Ivy," she asked. "Do you think people like us ever really get to win?" Ivy looked out the tall windows, over the hills glowing beneath the spring sun. "We don't need to win," she said. "We just need to stand. And never let them forget that we did." Jasmine smiled. And somewhere in the distance, wind rustled through the trees like applause no one could fake. That night, in the quiet of her new bedroom, once Logan's old suite, Ivy sat on the edge of the bed. The photo of her and Logan on their wedding day rested on the nightstand. She traced the edge of the frame with a fingertip. "You were right," she whispered. "They showed who they are." She looked at her reflection in the mirror. But so did I. The woman looking back at her wasn't quiet anymore. She wasn't waiting for approval. She had inherited more than an estate. She had inherited her own voice. And for the first time in her life, she used it to say the most powerful word of all, spoken only to herself, but strong enough to shake the walls of the mansion. Enough. The spring rain came softly that morning, brushing over the Thornhill estate like a whisper. Ivy stood at the edge of the east garden, beneath a pale gray sky, watching raindrops gather on rose petals. The house behind her no longer felt like a fortress of ghosts. It breathed now. Quiet, yes, but not empty. Alive in a new way. Jasmine ran toward her with a light blue umbrella in one hand and a folded letter in the other. Her cheeks were pink from the wind, her steps uncertain. "This came," she said, holding it out. "Delivered by hand. No name, just this. Ivy accepted the envelope carefully. Thick cream paper, a gold wax seal pressed clean in the center. Her brows furrowed slightly. She hadn't seen that seal in years. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. "There's one more truth you deserve." Signed, simply, A.G. Arthur Grayson. Ivy turned toward the house, heart beating with a rhythm she hadn't felt since the day Logan's final video played. She made her way down the west hallway, past portraits that no longer watched with judgment, into the private study Arthur had once used during family legal business. She hadn't opened that room since the day she signed the estate transfer. But something in the air called her to. The room smelled of ink and old wood. On the desk was a slim black folder. Its cover read, "Logan and Ivy, Premarital Recordings, Confidential." She opened it. Inside was a flash drive and a note. "He left these, Ivy. For you. Only you. I wasn't sure when to give them. Until today. Now I know." With steady fingers, she inserted the drive into the laptop beside her. The screen flickered to life. Logan's face appeared again, this time younger, his hair darker, no grays at the temples. He sat on a bench in what looked like a public park, sunlight falling through the trees behind him. He looked straight at the camera. At her. "Ivy," he began. "If you're seeing this, it means everything went the way we feared. Or hoped. Or both." His voice was calmer than the last time she heard it through a screen. This wasn't the man punishing a family. This was the man who loved her. "You've always said silence was your strength," he continued. "And I never argued. Because I saw what it cost you. But I recorded this because I need you to hear one thing, not from the grave, not through a lawyer, but straight from me. Before I was anyone's heir, before I had billions, I fell in love with a woman in a library who didn't even look up when I dropped my briefcase. And she changed everything." He smiled. "I watched you carry dignity like armor. I watched you swallow pain without letting it make you bitter. I watched you stand in rooms that tried to erase you, and never once did you lower your eyes." Ivy's throat tightened. "I built this will not to test them, Ivy. I built it to remind you who you are. You didn't need my name. Or this estate. But I knew, someday, they'd try to bury you with silence. And I wanted to make sure the whole world had to listen instead." He leaned closer, eyes filling the screen. "You were never the quiet one. You were the one they were afraid to hear." The video ended. But another file autoplayed. It was a recording, unpolished, audio only. Logan again, but his voice was different this time. Softer. Broken. "She doesn't know this, but the night before our courthouse wedding, I called my father." There was a long pause. "He said marrying her would be the end of my name. Said if I signed that paper, the family would disown me." I remember gripping the phone so tight my knuckles went white. I asked him one question, "Do you think your name matters more than someone's soul?" He hung up. Silence followed. "She told me that night, without knowing anything, you don't owe me anything grand. Just the truth. And that's what she gave me every day. Truth in her silence. Truth in her gaze. Truth in the way she held my hand when no one was watching." The file faded out. The screen went black. Ivy leaned back in the chair, heart heavy but strangely lifted. She now knew the full story. Logan hadn't just left her everything. He had tried, in every way, to leave her seen. That evening, Ivy walked alone down the long gravel path that wound through the edge of the estate toward the memorial garden they had begun building weeks before. The rain had stopped. The sky had opened into a soft violet dusk. There, at the garden gate, stood a man. He was tall, gray hair slick from the rain, dressed in a dark overcoat. His hands were clasped in front of him. She recognized him. Arthur Grayson. But beside him was a woman Ivy had never seen before, young, perhaps late 20s, dressed in a modest blue coat, holding a small velvet box. Arthur stepped forward. "Ivy," he said, voice lower than usual. "This is Elena. Logan's niece." Ivy blinked. "I didn't know he had one." He didn't either. Until just before he disappeared. Elena stepped closer. "My mother, she was his sister. Estranged. She raised me quietly. But she told me stories. That Logan used to send her letters. And then they stopped." She looked down. "When I saw the story about the will, about you, I knew I had to come." Ivy held Elena's gaze. "Why now?" Elena opened the velvet box. Inside was a key. Old, brass, worn by time. "My mother said Logan sent her this before he vanished. Said it was for someone who knew what silence meant. She never understood. But I think it's for you." Ivy reached out, touched the key. On its side was an engraving. "Library. Newark." Her breath caught. That was where they met. The old public library in Newark, where she had worked weekends, and Logan had wandered in searching for something he claimed was a rare manuscript, but really, was just a reason to speak to her. Elena stepped back. "I don't know what's there," she said. "But something told me I should bring it." Arthur looked at Ivy with quiet understanding. Some doors don't just open buildings. They open endings. 3 days later, Ivy stood in front of the Newark Public Library. It had long since closed, now sealed and scheduled for demolition. But the key fit the side door perfectly. Inside, the building smelled of dust and memory. Light from the broken window fell in long columns onto shelves that had been untouched for years. She wandered back toward the poetry section. Shelf 213B. And there, tucked behind a row of old volumes, was a journal. Her name written across the spine. Inside were dozens of pages. Logan's handwriting. Letters. Dreams. Notes from nights they spent talking. Sketches of a house filled with light, laughter, and love. On the final page, one line. "If they bury you in silence, break the ground with your voice." She closed the journal. Stepped out into the light. And behind her, as the wind stirred pages of old books and memories, the door to the past shut gently, without regret, without rage. Just peace. The kind that only comes when justice has been more than served, it has been earned. And in that moment, Ivy Walker didn't just inherit a fortune. She inherited the future. A future she was now ready to write herself. The spring rain came softly that morning, rushing over the Thornhill estate like a whisper. Ivy stood at the edge of the east garden, beneath a pale gray sky, watching raindrops gather on rose petals. The house behind her no longer felt like a fortress of ghosts. It breathed now. Quiet, yes, but not empty. Alive in a new way. Jasmine ran toward her with a light blue umbrella in one hand and a folded letter in the other. Her cheeks were pink from the wind, her steps uncertain. "This came," she said, holding it out. "Delivered by hand. No name, just this." Ivy accepted the envelope carefully. Thick cream paper, a gold-black seal pressed clean in the center. Her brows furrowed slightly. She hadn't seen that seal in years. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. "There's one more truth you deserve." Signed, simply, A.G. Arthur Grayson. Ivy turned toward the house, heart beating with a rhythm she hadn't felt since the day Logan's final video played. She made her way down the west hallway, past portraits that no longer watched with judgment, into the private study Arthur had once used during family legal business. She hadn't opened that room since the day she signed the estate transfer. But something in the air called her to. The room smelled of ink and old wood. On the desk was a slim black folder. Its cover read, Logan and Ivy, premarital recordings, confidential. She opened it. Inside was a flash drive and a note. He left these, Ivy. For you. Only you.